Absolute Brainiac is even scarier than Absolute Mr. Freeze. So today we're breaking down the 7th and latest issue of Absolute Superman, and if your brain needs a little so-called refresher, the last issue consisted of Cal finding out what life was like on the Kent farm after crash landing on Earth inside of his space shuttle, but unfortunately his time there was really short-lived and only lasted a few weeks because he was forced to leave Martha and John behind when somebody reported them for illegally housing a migrant, causing the Peacemakers to raid their home and unsuccessfully try taking Cal into custody. And then as the comic came to a close, we found out that none other than Ra's al Ghul is the man in charge of Brainiac, the man in charge of Lazarus Corp, and the man who so desperately wants to take down Superman. This issue, on the other hand, picks up with a small task force of Omega Men in the Nevada desert at a Lazarus Corp's research and development center. And if you don't remember, in the Absolute universe, the Omega Men are like a giant rebellion group whose mission is ending Lazarus Corp's corruption. So they secretly infiltrated one of their development centers to try and shut down the Braniac AI because the Braniac AI plays a huge part in keeping Lazarus Corp and all the Peacemakers organized. But just a few short moments after their arrival, Brainiac realized that he was under attack, and immediately upon this realization, he tapped into their communication network and then unleashed his wrath in the most brutal way possible, skinning the first one alive by shrinking all of his skin, killing the next one by removing all of his muscles, and then forcing the third victim to puke out his own guts and bones. Upon seeing all of this go down, the last remaining Omega Man was like, screw this, I'm getting out of here. So he tried contacting HQ and expressing that he needed immediate evac, but to his misfortune, he was struck by one of Brainiac's laser beams just moments later, which mutated his hand to the size of a giant. And then Brainiac threw all these little miniature spike balls all over his body, which prohibited him from moving, which leads us to our first full reveal of Brainiac in the Absolute universe. And man, does he look terrifying. He's got these giant robotic legs, and almost like Joker-esque face, and then wires like jammed into his brain and all these different parts of his body. But as we move forward into one of his laboratories, we see that he didn't actually kill the last remaining member of the Omega Men, instead choosing to tinker with and experiment on his body, even going as far as separating his brain from the inside of his head and making it inhabit a test pod. Moments later though, upon looking over his shoulder at a screen full of Superman images, his blood began boiling with rage because no matter what him or Lazarus Corp did, they just couldn't figure out who or where he was, and even when they did know where he was, their attempts to capture him always resulted in failure. He'd then look over towards a nearby desk or shelf where he kept all of his shrunken cities, calling the people who inhabited them useless fleas due to their lack of information on Superman, before smashing one of the cities on the ground and using his giant prosthetic leg to squash its people like bugs. Now, if you couldn't already tell, this version of Brainiac is an extremely psychotic version of Brainiac, but somehow it gets even worse, because after smashing the city, he started having like a one-sided conversation with the Omega Men member that he'd been experimenting on, expressing that he was sorry he had to see his little tantrum and that he could lose his mind a bit when he got angry. He then stated that he's literally tried carving out the parts of his brain that caused these outbursts, but so far it was to no success, so he'd have to keep on digging. Now, after this little rant of insanity, the dude on the experimentation table tried uttering a few words out of his mouth, but thanks to the current state of his condition, it was hard to make out what he was saying. So Brainiac pretty much just continued with his one-sided conversation, indicating that he's never had somebody he could talk to before and he really appreciated the company. So much so that he then decided to tell him his entire life story from the moment he first gained consciousness. And guys, this origin is literally so sad and so insane. Like, I'm kinda jealous that you guys get to hear it for the first time. So his first experience of anything ever was when another Brainiac just ordered him to wake up by saying, Brainiac 419,732 begin life mode. Your work shift will commence immediately. And at first 419 was really confused with what was going on, so his higher up went on to explain that he served the collective. So 419 asked him what the collective was, but his higher up told him that he wasn't allowed to know, indicating that only level 88 effectors and above were allowed to seek knowledge beyond the job they were created for. So again, out of curiosity, 419 was like, well, what level am I? To which his superior responded, 0, before handing him a shovel and telling him that his only function was to shovel refuse into the liquidator. Unsurprisingly though, 419 was also confused as to what refuse was, so the higher up was like, yeah, so you see that giant pile of mangled and broken Brainiacs over there? Yeah, that's refuse, and you're already behind schedule, so start shoveling immediately. But before he could walk out of the door, 419 had one last question to ask him. How long long was his shift gonna last? To which the superior Brainiac responded, as long as you do. We then see Brainiac picking up his shovel, scooping up giant piles of mangled and battle damaged Brainiacs, and throwing them into the liquidator while repeating to himself over and over again, I serve the collective. We then fast forward all the way over to day 2844, where Brainiac is tirelessly doing the exact same thing, except on this day, one of the Brainiacs, or Refuse, whatever you want to call him, was still functioning enough to be able to jump out at 419 and try killing him by stabbing him with a giant knife. And in the process of doing so, he says, I am Brainiac 8,238,759. I stab, I kill. Now keep in mind, our Brainiac is 419,732. This dude is 8,238,759. So the Brainiac collective is blowing through these guys like crazy. And it has to be because they're in some sort of planetary or cosmic war or something, because I don't see why they would be so high if they weren't. And the fact that this one is specifically programmed to kill, or they're probably just trying to conquer the galaxy. Anyways, we see that 419 is able to hold his own and is able to put this extremely aggressive Brainiac into his grave by jamming his shovel into his jaw and then throwing him into the liquidator just like he does everybody else. The story then jumps ahead all the way to day 13,638, where our Brainiac is so worn down that his face is falling apart, you can see wires sticking out of him, and you can tell that this is where he started losing sanity because he actually propped up some of the Refuse so he could act like he had company and people to conversate with. But if you thought 13,000 days was a lot of days to work, well, you'd be right, but the story then jumps over to day 49,901. And this is where things get kind of crazy, because if you look at the scans, the room he's in is now completely empty. So he walked over to a nearby door, asking if anyone was out there and stating that there hadn't been any Refuse in a long while. But because nobody responded to him, he decided to jam his shovel into the door and pry it open himself. He then walked all throughout the facility, asking if Brainiac was there, the main Brainiac who we talked to earlier, but he didn't get any sort of response. Soon enough though, upon walking into some sort of giant observation room, he realized that he was in a giant spaceship and that Brainiac 1 was actually dead, giving him the courage to express that he was the main Brainiac now, before promoting himself to a level 100 effector, which pretty much gave him access to everything on the ship. After that, the story comes back over to present day, where he's talking to his disfigured friend on the experimentation table, and he says, in the days since, as I've carved my mark across the face of creation, I've sometimes paused to consider the possibility that it would have been better for everyone, me included, if I'd stayed in that room with the shovel. But where would be the fun in that? And in the process of saying all of this, he's also crushing another one of his shrunken cities and all the people inside. As we move forward though, Brainiac elected to contact the Brainiac Collective to see if they had any information concerning Superman or where he came from. However, most collective members were confused and irritated because 1, they didn't have any idea who our Brainiac was since he promoted himself to level 100 effector, and 2, they thought his whole Superman inquiry was a waste of their time. But eventually one of the Brainiacs spoke up, expressing Superman was from Krypton, the only habitable orb that was capable of surviving a red sun. So Brainiac was like, what else is known of this Krypton? To which the other Brainiac responded, only that it was and that it is no more. Krypton exploded. They then go on to say that no Brainiac ever set foot upon the planet because it never warranted the interest of the collective. Whoever its people were, they never even managed to develop interstellar travel. But one Brainiac did recently visit the former site of Krypton, where they were able to retrieve samples of its meteoroid remains, and these remains displayed an exquisitely virulent range of radioactivity. They then transfer the elemental composition of the remains over to our Brainiac ship, which is when we finally realized that they were talking about kryptonite. Now after that, 419 was confident he got what he needed, so he ended the transmission with the Brainiac Collective and got to work immediately. And when I say he got to work, I mean he thanked the Omega member for being such a great listener before smashing the pod holding his brain onto the ground and then printing his own piece of kryptonite just shortly after. And while he marveled at his new weapon once the printing process was over, he ordered the Brainiacs he was now in control of to start cleaning up his mess, and it's just so beautiful to see how far he's come from being the shovel kid. I feel like a proud father. But as the issue comes to a close, we get a crazy cliffhanger, because it turns out that behind the scenes he's been cybernetically enhancing Peacemaker Smith, the same Peacemaker who crashed out, lost control of his emotions, and killed a bunch of innocent people in like issue number 5 or 6, and he's just turning him into some sort of crazy weapon so he can deploy him into Smallville, Kansas. And Braniac says that Smallville, Kansas is soon to be the most dangerous war zone on the entire planet. But sadly, that's where our issue comes to an end. But if you guys want to see what happens next, let me know in the comments down below.